90%. Is that right?
That's right.
And so the first step that you undertook when you received those two samples in June of 1994 was to extract the DNA from the 90% portion of those two samples. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
And this extraction of items of DNA from items 49 and 50, this was done before Drs. Blake and Dr. Lee even visited your laboratory. Isn't that correct?
That's right.
Now, after the extraction process, Dr. Cotton, you took a small portion of the extracted DNA and you ran, I think, what you described as either a test gel or a yield gel to determine approximately how much DNA is present?
That's right.
And is that what you actually did with items 49 and 50?
Well, I didn't actually do it myself, but that's what was done with 49 and 50.
And as to both items 49 and 50, when that little mini gel test was run, you concluded that there was too little DNA present for RFLP testing. Is that correct?
And we concluded it was too degraded for RFLP testing.
Okay. Now, in some situations, Dr. Cotton, after you take that small portion of the 90% and do that test, would you be able to recycle the balance of the 90% to use for other forms of testing, such as PCR testing?
We would only do that if we had run a reagent blank control during that DNA extraction.
If you had run a reagent blank control that we just described during that part of the processing of items 49 and 50, then you would be able to recycle the balance of that 90% of unused DNA. Is that correct?
That's right.
But in this case, Dr. Cotton, your laboratory simply didn't run a reagent blank negative control for items 49 and 50. Is that correct?
Not at the time that we did that first extraction.
And so for items 49 and 50, at least as to the bulk of that 90% of the material that you received, it could not be recycled for PCR testing, could it?
Well, you could do it. You simply wouldn't have a reagent blank control to run along with it. So we did not use that initial extracted DNA when we did our PCR test on that sample.
Well, the reason you didn't use the balance of that 90% portion is because you could not know for sure whether or not there was some contamination that occurred with respect to items 49 and 50 without having a reagent blank. Isn't that right?
Yes, we couldn't know what had happened during that DNA extraction.
And so to be scientifically cautious, you didn't use that portion of 49 and 50, which you failed to use a reagent blank on, for follow-up PCR testing. Is that correct?
That's right.
Okay. Does your laboratory keep a centralized log indicating the number of times that you failed to run a particular control?
No, we don't have any kind of log like that. Never mind. We don't have a log like that.
All right. Dr. Cotton, do you agree with the following proposition? If a negative control is positive in one experiment, it indicates a potential problem, not just for that experiment, but for any experiment performed by the laboratory at about the same time.
I agree that that might be the case, but in other words, it might indicate that there were problems with other experiments, or it might indicate there was a problem just with the one thing that you did. And you'd have to go back and look at other things to make that determination.
Well, that's
So
all
I guess I don't agree with that statement.
You don't agree with it?
Not completely, no.
Well, the statement simply says it indicates a potential problem, not a definitive problem.
Okay.
No,
I'll go
now
for
that it says that,
potential
you would agree
problem.
with that?
Wait.
Sorry. Let me repeat the proposition one more time, Dr. Cotton. If a blank control is positive in one experiment, it indicates a potential problem, not just for that experiment, but for any experiment performed at about the same time. Would you agree with that proposition?
Over.
I would agree with that statement as you read it, yes.
Okay. And Dr. Cotton, are you familiar with that portion of the National Academy of Science report, DNA Technology and Forensic Science, which addresses the issue regarding the consequences of a control failure in PCR testing?
Objection. Assumes facts, not in evidence.
Sustained.
Well,
Also move to strike. Counsel's comment.
Over. Ask
Have you-
Ask Dr. Cotton if she's familiar with that part of the report.
are you familiar with the portion of the NRC report entitled DNA Technology and Forensic Science, which addresses that same issue, the consequences of a control failure?
Can you just tell me what the title of that section is?
It's page 67 of the NRC report, if you'd like to take a look at it. It begins on 65 and runs through 67. In particular, Dr. Cotton, could you take a look at one portion of that just to save time?
The statement that you just pointed out to me is the one that you just read to me.
Okay, and in fact, in your own copy of that book, do you have that same statement underlined?
Yes, I have many things highlighted in this book.
And is that statement that I just read to you, in fact, one of those statements?
Yes.
And is that a portion of the NRC report that you, in fact, relied upon in coming to an expert opinion as to the consequences of a control failure in PCR testing?
I've read this portion of the book. I'm having a little trouble with this concept of relied upon. I've read this portion of the book. I agree with some of it, and I don't agree with other parts. I happen to agree with that statement, but if you ask me, did I agree with and rely upon that whole section, I would have to say no.
But,
All right, she's indicated she agreed with the portion that you read.
Right.
All right. Next question.
and when you read that paragraph, did you also read the very next sentence?
Not just this, not when I was looking at it just now.
Okay, please do.
I'm sorry, objection.
Over.
We're back on 67, right?
Yes.
I don't really agree with this next statement, but our laboratory hasn't been in that position, so I don't know. I don't really have a strong opinion one way or the other.
Well, Dr. Cotton, would this be a portion of the NRC report, namely this next sentence, that you relied upon in reaching your own opinions as to what actions to take when there was a failure of a control in PCR testing?
No.
One moment. Well, with the court's permission, may I read the entire sentence that she said she agreed with?
We've been through this already.
I only, as I stated as a proposition, a portion of a sentence. She's now read the entire sentence and said that she agrees with it.
Ask her the question.
Thank you. Dr. Cotton, do you agree with the opinion of the scientist who authored the DNA Technology and Forensic Science book for the National Academy of Science, in which they say, quote,
Oh, excuse me, objection, hearsay. As framed.
Sustained, as framed.
well, may we have a sidebar, Your Honor?
Nope. It's a very simple hearsay issue. Counsel, proceed.
Dr. Cotton, a moment ago when you said you agreed with and relied on that sentence, were you referring to this sentence? And I quote,
Excuse me, objection misstates the evidence.
Sustained.
may I be heard on this issue, Your Honor?
Very simple hearsay issue. Counsel, move on.
I would simply ask to make a record on that issue, Your Honor.
Nope. Move on. The objection is sustained. You can make any argument at the break. We'll break at 10:30.
In your laboratory, Dr. Cotton, whenever there has been an instance, I'm sorry, a moment. In your laboratory, Dr. Cotton, has there ever been an instance when in a similar period of time, several different technicians saw DNA results on the negative controls where nothing should be visualized?
Yes, we had that occur one time.
And whenever there has been an instance where more than one technician or scientist observes a failure in the negative controls, do you document that phenomena in any laboratory-wide log?
The instance is documented in terms of a report that goes to the quality control assurance manager, and what was done to correct it also goes to her.
So there would
In
be-
terms of, a brief statement of this is what happened, this is what we did.
So even at Cellmark, there have been occasions where the negative controls failed.
Yes, and I want to be very clear about what I'm saying. We had one instance in which the negative control that's set up at the time of amplification was giving us a signal, and we had to go back and figure out that negative control it turned out that it by itself was contaminated, but it could have been some other result. And anyway, we had to stop doing what we were doing, go back and figure that out, and then restart testing.
And would it be fair to say, Dr. Cotton, that for each and every time where you've had the negative control failure, you have been able to determine by your investigation exactly how the contamination occurred in every instance when it did occur?
Objection misstates the evidence.
Sustained. Phrase the question.
Well, there have been more than one occasion where a negative control has failed. Is that correct?
No, what I'm trying to tell you is there was one instance where we saw that, and I'm calling it one instance because it was confined to a period of 1 or 2 days. And so it wasn't just one test. Let me be clear. It wasn't just one test. There were several tests done over that period of 2 days, but it was this period of a couple of days that we had this problem, and that is the only period of time that we have had that particular problem.
So with respect to having that particular problem where the negative control failed over a period of 1 or 2 days in multiple tests, were you able to determine the precise cause for that failure?
We were able to, an answer is really no. We didn't know the precise cause.
One moment. And Dr. Cotton, in your laboratory, when that phenomena occurred over a period of 1 or 2 days in multiple tests, seeing DNA in the negative controls where it shouldn't be, would you refer to that phenomena as an outbreak of contamination?
I didn't refer to it like that, no.
Would you say that that's a fair characterization of it?
No.
Have you ever heard that term before?
I've heard it in court before. I've not heard it in scientific discussions. You just said a moment ago that you only heard it in court proceedings and not in scientific papers. Is that correct? I said discussions. That is, discussions I've had, or I can only talk about discussions I've had with people in other laboratories or in my own laboratory. If we have an instance of contamination, we don't generally refer to it as an outbreak. It sounds like we're getting the measles or something. And it's just not a term that I've ever heard used in discussing this potential problem with other scientists.
Dr. Cotton, you said that you read the NRC report many times. Is that right?
Yes.
When you read the NRC report, did you see them describe it as an outbreak of contamination?
Overruled.
Well, they may well have. I don't know. I mean, I can't, if you look at all the stuff that I have to read, I cannot remember word for word what's in the NRC report, what's in our standard operating procedure, and so forth. So if it's in there, fine.
Dr.
But-
Cotton, would you...
I'm sorry, can the witness
Wait.
finish her answer,
Sorry,
please?
I thought she had. I
But it
apologize.
doesn't change the fact that when we discuss this in our lab and when I've discussed it with other people, that is not the terminology that I have used or I have heard anyone else use in the setting as I characterized it.
Dr. Cotton, please go back and look at the very same page we just looked at a moment ago, page 67, and the very same paragraph, and the very next paragraph.
All right, objection. Relevance hearsay.
Overruled.
Yes.
Isn't it a fact that the NRC report states,
Objection hearsay.
Sustain.
it's for a different purpose, Your Honor.
Sustain. Ask the question appropriately.
Isn't it a fact, Dr. Cotton, that the NRC report describes this phenomena as...
Same objection, Your Honor.
Sustain. Dr. Cotton, you've
Yes, sir.
reviewed that, that
Paragraph.
paragraph.
Yes, I have.
All right. Then, does that refresh your recollection as to that terminology?
They use the term outbreaks of contamination in this paragraph.
Fine. Thank you.
Thank you, Your Honor. Do you agree, Dr. Cotton, that it is important to discover the source of a outbreak of contamination so that the laboratory can be cleansed of it?
No, I don't agree that you must determine the source. Sometimes that's simply not possible.
All right,
Do you-
Mr. Neufeld, the court reporter tells me she's about to run out of paper. So we'll take our break at this point. Do you have one or two more wind-up?
No, I don't. We can take our break right now.
All right. All right, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to take a recess for the morning session. Please remember all of my admonitions to you. Do not discuss the case amongst yourselves, form any opinions about the case. Don't conduct any deliberations till the matter has been submitted to you. Don't allow anybody to communicate with you with regard to the case. And we'll take a 15-minute recess. Good morning again, Dr. Cotton.
Good morning.
Mr. Neufeld.
Thank you. Good morning. Dr. Cotton, when you referred to the phenomenon in your laboratory where there was multiple instances of negative control failure occurring, when did that happen? You know the date?
No, I don't know the date without, it was sometime in the last 2 years, but I don't know the
Can
exact
you be more
date.
specific, even as to the month?
No.
Do you know how many cases were included in those control failures?
I think it was about somewhere like 4 or 6, something like that.
And for each of those 4 or 6 cases, how many samples were there tested where the negative controls failed?
I have absolutely no idea. It wouldn't have been necessarily all the samples in that case. It could have been like one sample that was done at that time, but how many, I don't have any idea.
Is there a centralized log which one could access to see how many samples had the negative controls fail in that period?
No.
Would you agree, Dr. Cotton, that it is important to find out the source of the contamination causing the negative controls to fail so that you can correct the cause and thus reduce the likelihood of reoccurrence?
It's nice if you can find out the source, but many times that's not possible, so I would not agree that it was essential or necessary.
Well, in this case, Dr. Cotton, isn't it true that a reagent blank that was supposed to be blank displayed DNA dots?
Do you want to rephrase that? This case, when you say this case, are we talking about the
Oh, I'm
contamination?
sorry. In this case, right here in this courtroom, involving Mr. Simpson, isn't it true that a reagent blank that was supposed to be blank displayed DNA dots?
Yes, there was one.
And I believe you said on direct examination that there can be 2 possible explanations for that occurrence. Do you recall that?
I do.
And I believe you said that one possible explanation is that there was a minute contamination during the original extraction, which was magnified when it was concentrated along with item 7. Do you recall saying something like that?
Yes, I do. That's a good restatement of what I said, or what I meant anyway.
Now, is it also possible that a second explanation would be that during the concentration procedure itself, the contamination occurred?
Yes,
So those would be the 2 possible explanations that you came up with.
that's right.
Now, would you agree, Dr. Cotton, that if one doesn't know which explanation is correct, that to be cautious, it is incumbent on the laboratory to assume that the contamination occurred during the initial extraction?
No. I mean, there's 2 possibilities. There's no way to distinguish between them, so I think it would be inappropriate to assume one or the other.
Okay, well, if there's no way that you can prove which one it is, then certainly the explanation that the contamination that led to the reagent blank failure occurred furthest back in time as a possible theory. Isn't that correct?
Well, certainly that's possible, yes.
All right. Now, there were other samples that were extracted during that extraction of when you set up the reagent blank. Isn't that right?
Yes, that's right.
And would you agree that the other items in this case that were extracted at the same time as the commencement of the reagent blank were items 78, 56, 52, 47, and 12?
I'd rather go into my notebooks.
Please do.
Okay. Okay, I have the beginning of the notes on that set of samples.
Okay. And is item 78 included in that list?
The reason I'm having trouble is that our numbers are different than the item 78 numbers, so what's in the information that I'm looking at are just our own numbers, and it doesn't say item 78, so we have to, let me just find the piece of paper and take it out that allows me to easily go back and forth
Please do.
between the two sets. Okay, yes, item 78 was in that group.
And is item 56 in that group?
Yes, it is.
Is item 52 in that group?
Yes, it is.
And item 52 is the one where you did RFLP analysis, correct?
That's right.
And is item 47 in that group?
Yes, it is.
And is item 12 in that group?
Yes.
And are there any other items
that's
in
right.
that group that I left out?
You'll have to give me a minute, and I'll let you know.
Okay.
No, that's it.
Dr. Cotton, given the presence of DNA on the reagent blank negative control happening when you ran that batch of items that you just enumerated, shouldn't you have gone back and repeated the extraction procedure for those 5 items in the case?
No.
Doesn't your protocol, Dr. Cotton, say that if the reagent blank fails, then all the samples must be re-extracted?
The reagent blank for the other samples, apart from our sample 06, which is item 7, when that reagent blank was originally typed, it typed with no DNA signal visible at all. Therefore, the sets of the samples apart from sample 7 that did not get put through the microcon could not have been even if we assume, if we just say for the sake of assumption that there was some minor level of contamination that got concentrated later by the microcon, it was not at a sufficiently high level to produce any product whatsoever, and therefore it couldn't have affected the types that we came up with on the set of samples apart from the one that went through the microcon.
Well, Dr. Cotton, isn't it true that a contaminant does not necessarily have to contaminate all samples in the same quantity?
Given that all these things are in solution and based on the solutions would be normally considered to be even distributions of molecules, I don't really think that that's an important consideration.
But isn't that true, Dr. Cotton, only if you can assume what the cause of the contamination in the reagent blank is?
No, I think that since the reagent blank contamination clearly didn't show up in that first set of samples, that it does not present any problem to that first set of samples.
Dr. Cotton, doesn't your protocol explicitly state that if the reagent blank fails, then the entire experiment for the samples that are run with it should be deemed inconclusive? Isn't that in your protocol?
I'd have to look at the protocol to see what it specifically states, but in the protocol we don't usually use the word experiment, so it'd be better to go back and look at what it specifically states. I believe that it states that if possible the sample should be run again.
And does it also state, to your recollection, that the data should be deemed inconclusive?
Yes, it states that, but I can't tell you right off the top of my head if it states that as an absolute or it should be that's a possibility that should be considered.
We'll just show you the following document, see if it refreshes your recollection on this particular point. Thank you. Doesn't your protocol say that that when this happens, the test will be considered inconclusive? When I say this, I mean when the reagent blank fails.
Yes.
It doesn't say it could possibly be considered inconclusive, does it? Doesn't qualify it that way.
Well, there is a sentence later on that refers to the PhDs using their discretion when, and I can't restate the sentence exactly, maybe you can find it there, but there is some discretion there on the part of the PhD. And this sample before, it was amplified before it went through the microcon, and that amplification was also later on typed. So the sample wasn't exactly done in duplicate, but the results were obtained twice.
Dr. Cardin, in fact, two people reviewed this same reagent blank, and both people concluded that there were DNA dots present, correct?
There are two.
There was no dissenting opinion on that, was there?
No.
All right. And in fact, I believe you said a moment ago that you should try to do re-extractions of the samples, but I believe it's your position that's not essential. Is that correct?
Well, in this case, I don't know that, again, I'd have to go back into the notes. I can't tell you whether or not we had enough sample available to do a re-extraction.
Well, to the best of your knowledge, did you make any effort at attempting to re-extract those samples?
In order to answer your, well, I know that we didn't, but what I can't tell you without going back into the record is whether or not there was anything that was available to us to go back and re-extract.
Would you please take a look at your notes to see whether or not any effort was made by Cellmark to do a re-extraction on those samples that were typed at the same time that the reagent blank tested positive?
I'm sorry, I guess I didn't understand when you asked me the first time. I thought you were referring to just sample item number 7.
No, I'm asking you whether or not efforts were made to do a new extraction from items 78, 52, 56, 47, and 12 after you got a negative control failure on the reagent blank.
We didn't get a reagent blank control failure for those items because the reagent blank typed with those items prior to putting it through a microcon was not positive, and those items were not repeated.
Dr. Codden, didn't you say a few minutes ago that one possible explanation for the DNA dots appearing on the reagent blank could be that when the initial extraction occurred, before you even reprocessed it, that when the initial extraction occurred, that's when the contamination occurred? Didn't you say that, doctor?
Yes, I did, but the reagent blank dots don't show up. If they don't show up with a set of samples, they can't have influenced anything. If you can't see anything, it can't have affected the types.
Well, Dr. Codden, you would agree that somehow there was a contaminant that got into that reagent blank that created some DNA to be present. Isn't that right?
Judge can ask and answer.
Oh,
Somehow a contaminant got in there that caused the reagent blank to be positive at the point for item 7 after the microcon concentration had happened.
And when you created the reagent blank, you created it at the same time as you extracted those other samples that I just described, namely 78, 52, 56, 47, and 12. Isn't that right?
It was started at the same time, yes, but the end result, the reagent blank that gave the end result with 2 faint dots on it had gone through an additional procedure that the other items handled apart from item 7 did not go through.
But finally, Dr. Cotton, didn't you say that you can't rule out the possibility that the contamination of the reagent blank occurred prior to that additional step, that it
Yeah.
occurred during the initial extraction?
That's right, but I can rule out the possibility that it affected the types.
Do you even know to this day what actually happened to precipitate that reagent blank from lighting up with DNA dots?
No, it would be impossible to determine that at the time you did the work or at this point.
Now, I ask you to turn your attention to item 78. The stain removed from the bottom of the boot on Mr. Goldman.
And do you want me to look at PCR information or RFLP?
I believe you have a report on December 5th that refers to both, but I may be mistaken. Let me ask you this. By December 5th, you had completed both the RFLP testing and the PCR testing. Isn't that correct?
That's my recollection, yes.
And I believe it was your testimony on direct examination, Dr. Cotton, that the banding patterns that you observed in item 78 could be consistent with a banding pattern of Nicole Brown Simpson. Is that right?
Yes.
But I believe you also said that with respect to the other band seen, it was simply inconclusive as to whether or not Mr. Goldman is included or excluded. Is that correct?
That's exactly right.
Now, let's turn to the fingernail scrapings. You did not actually receive fingernail scrapings from the Los Angeles Police Department, did you?
No,
And you did not receive fingernail cuttings from the Los Angeles Police Department, did you?
that's correct.
What you received were solutions, if you will, from the Department of Justice DNA laboratory in Berkeley. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And you do not know what portion of the scrapings were utilized to do the DNA typing, do you?
To do the DNA typing in our laboratory
Yes.
or
You don't know from where in the fingernail scrapings a sample was taken for you to do DNA typing in your laboratory. Isn't that correct?
Oh, yes, that's correct.
And you do not know from where on the fingernail cuttings the samples were removed for you to do DNA typing in your laboratory.
Yes, that's correct.
And would it be fair to say that you do not know whether the samples or the portions of the samples that Greg Matheson utilized for EAP typing at the LAPD laboratory could have been different portions of those samples?
That's right, I don't know that.
And would you also agree that one second. With permission, I'd like to show the witness a slide which is already in evidence, 1143 D.
Proceed.
Can you see that slide, Dr. Cotton?
May I step down and view it from down there?
Sure. Take
Does it matter?
your time.
No. Whatever you feel most comfortable with, Doctor. Mr. Neufeld.
Are you aware, Dr. Cotton, that in this particular case, an EAP test was done by Gregory Matheson, which provided a result that was different than the EAP profile for Nicole Brown Simpson?
I'm aware that he did a test, and I'm aware there was some difference.
Okay. And would you agree, Dr. Cotton, that when you are doing an EAP test, you are looking at what is known as a red blood cell protein?
Yes.
And would you agree, Dr. Cotton, that red blood cells do not have DNA in them?
Yes, that's correct.
And just to go back for a second, Dr. Cotton, to clarify it for me, in blood cells there are two types of cells, correct?
Well, there are really many kinds of cells.
All right.
If you want to get real fine differentiations, but if you want to classify them as red cells and white cells, for our purposes, that's going to work fine.
Okay. And Dr. Cotton, it's only the white cells that have the DNA, is that right?
Yes,
And the red cells for which you do an EAP test on do not have DNA.
that's right.
Thank you. You can have your seat again, please. I believe one of the statements you made on direct examination, Dr. Cotton, was the more genetic markers you look at, the more information you have. Is that a fair statement?
Yes,
And would you agree, Dr. Cotton, that that would apply to conventional serological markers as well as to DNA genetic markers?
I would think so.
For instance, Dr. Cotton, would you agree that you could include somebody with a PCR DQ alpha type and then, for instance, do an ABO test, which excludes a person?
Yes, you could do that. I don't know enough about ABO testing to know the intricacies of what exact kinds of results you get, but could that phenomenon happen? Certainly.
And when you're looking at an ABO test, you're not looking at that person's ABO typing on a DNA level. Isn't that correct?
That's right.
And would you agree, Dr. Cotton, that likewise the fingernail scrapings could appear to be consistent with Nicole Brown Simpson for certain DNA markers, but she could be excluded based on a red cell protein marker? That that's possible.
It's possible, yes.
Let me ask you one other question about these fingernail scrapings, Dr. Cotton. You had said on direct examination that sometimes the scientists in your laboratory are asked to examine a lane from the electrophoretic plate without being influenced by the bands they see on the lane to the left or the bands they see on the lane to the right. Do you recall saying that?
Yes, I did.
And you mentioned that, I believe you said, well, one of the things you want to avoid sometimes is a term called examiner bias.
I didn't say that.
Have you ever heard the expression examiner bias?
Yes.
And not just in forensic context, but have you heard that term used in conjunction with people who are asked to score autorads?
Again, it's something that I've been asked about sometimes in court. It's not something we normally are discussing in the lab, but I don't have anything more to say about it than that.
Okay. Well, would you agree, Dr. Cotton, that one way to avoid examiner bias on a particular lane that you're asked to score is to do what you said earlier on direct examination, namely cover up the information on the adjacent lanes and just look at the lane under question?
From what we do in the lab with autoradiographs, we do that sometimes because sometimes it's helpful in determining whether a band is sufficiently dark to score it.
Okay. Now, I want to show you an item which is People's 224B in evidence, which Mr. Matheson was asked to score using that same method, namely where you cover up the adjacent lanes and interpret it. I'm going to ask you to take a look at that same lane, Dr. Cotton.
Mr. Neufeld, can I offer you some Post-its?
I'm going to use Now,
Objections to foundation.
To ask a few foundational questions. Mr. Neufeld?
Dr. Cotton, have there been times when you have been asked to look at electrophoretic plates or photographs of electrophoretic plates to determine when a certain band may be controversial as to its existence or non-existence, to make a call on that by covering up the adjacent lanes?
Objection vague as to electrophoretic and also beyond the scalp.
Which test are we talking about here?
I'm going to show her it's the EAP, Your Honor.
Sustain on scope.
Separate and apart, Dr. Cotton, for a particular type of test, would you agree, however, that it is a recognized procedure when you have a difficult-to-interpret lane to cover up the adjacent lanes and score it blindly?
Well, again, I can only speak for what we do in our lab, and what we do in our lab only pertains to DNA testing. So in our lab, that's a procedure that we use. I can't really speak to anything else.
Well, but Dr. Cotton, even in the field of medical research on DNA testing, isn't that a procedure that is also sometimes used in that application?
Well, again, I can only tell you what I've done. I didn't do that when I was running RFLP gels when I was doing research. I just didn't. We do it in our lab for the purpose that I described of trying to determine whether we can all see a particular band. And that's the extent of my use of that procedure.
And would it be fair to say that you at least regard it as an appropriate scientific procedure for the use in your laboratory?
Yes, I do.
Okay. Now, I'd like to ask you some questions about proficiency testing. Okay? You had referred on direct examination to the fact that Cellmark undergoes proficiency testing. Is that right?
Yes, that's right.
And you referred to different types of proficiency testing that Cellmark has undergone. Is that correct?
That's right.
And isn't it true, Dr. Cotton, that the Cellmark laboratory makes available a summary of your laboratory's error rate as measured by proficiency testing?
Objection vague.
Oh.
We make available a summary of the lists of the number of tests, the number of samples that were involved, and if you were to calculate error rate using a specific formula, that calculation is also on that summary sheet.
I'm not asking you about what the error rate is or
I
specific
understand.
numbers at this time, Dr. Cotton. All I'm saying is, don't you, in fact, on that summary that you send out, actually refer to it as an error rate?
Yes, we do.
Okay. And would you agree, Dr. Cotton, that one of the purposes of proficiency testing is to provide a measure of error rate, just as you did in the summary that you handed out?
You can do that with the results. In my mind, that's not the main purpose, but it's certainly a calculation that one can do.
I'm not asking whether it's the main purpose, Dr. Cotton. I'm asking if that's one of the purposes.
Yes, it is.
And would you agree, Dr. Cotton, that there are different types of proficiency testing?
Oh, yes. I agree.
Next in order is 1153, Your Honor.
All right, defense 1153.
Yeah. Now, Dr. Cotton, would you agree that one type of proficiency test is known as open proficiency tests?
Yes.
Okay? I'm going to call this chart proficiency test, if that's all right with you, because we're going to be describing proficiency tests. Is that okay?
It's okay with me.
Okay. Now, one type you said is an open proficiency test, is that right?
Yes.
And another type of proficiency test is called a blind proficiency test, is that right?
Yes.
And the difference between an open test and a blind test, Dr. Cotton, is that in a blind test, the laboratory is unaware that it's being tested, isn't that correct?
That's right.
And in an open test, you're aware that it's a test, as opposed to actual casework.
That's right.
And furthermore, Dr. Cotton, there's another way to break down proficiency tests, isn't there? Well, let me ask you this way. Other than simply dividing those tests which are open from those tests which are blind, can you also separate those tests which are internal from those tests which are external?
Yes.
And in an internal proficiency test, the proficiency test is actually created by the laboratory itself. It's going to be tested.
That's right.
And on an external proficiency test, some outside agency is going to create this proficiency test and give it to the laboratory, such as Cellmark, to be tested.
That's right.
And so you would agree that there are basically 4 types of proficiency tests, based on what we've just discussed. Is that a fair statement?
Sure.
And one type then would be called an open external test. Is that right?
Yes, maybe I should come down and watch you draw.
Okay. And a second type of proficiency test will be called an open internal test, namely a test where the laboratory knows it's being tested and the test was made inside the laboratory. Isn't that correct?
Yes.
And based on what you just testified to as to the 4 different categories of proficiency testing, the third category would be called a blind external test, correct?
Yes.
And a fourth category would be a blind internal test. Is that correct?
Yes.
Check out Proficiency.
It's been brought to my attention by my colleagues that this New York lawyer also has a spelling problem, and there should be an I in here. Is that correct, Dr. Cotton?
Yeah, I have a spelling problem too, though, so.
It's an East Coast phenomenon. Thank you, Dr. Cotton. So, would you agree that these are the 4 categories of proficiency tests?
Yeah, you can break them down, and that's a
All right,
way to do that.
great. Could you just help me? Why don't you do it? Thank you. So the other 3 is here.
All right, Mr. Neufeld, proceed.
Yeah, well, I'd like to put it over on the side, if I may, Your Honor, because I'm going to be referring to it during the next portion of the questioning.
Proceed.
Now, Dr. Cotton, when you prepare tests yourself, when I say you, I don't mean you personally, Dr. Cotton, I mean Cellmark, the Cellmark Laboratory, you're of course familiar with the strengths and weaknesses in your own laboratory, aren't you?
I hope so.
Now, but when an external agency prepares a test, they're preparing a test that's going to go out to a number of different laboratories generally, isn't that correct?
That's right.
And the external agency is not simply thinking to itself, well, what are Cellmark's strengths and weaknesses? That's not how it works, is it?
I hope not.
Okay. And would you agree, Dr. Cotton, that a proficiency test that mirrors actual casework would be a good basis for measuring laboratory error rate, as opposed to a proficiency test that doesn't replicate actual casework?
What do you mean by replicating actual casework?
Well, for instance, if you were interested in how well the laboratory analyzed forensic samples, you wouldn't rely on a proficiency test where you received simply, a statement saying that we're giving you 4 pristine pieces of white cloth, which we simply dabbed a single blood drop on, and we want you to type that. Would you agree with that?
Oh,
Well, that's pretty much like a forensic case sample. You have standards that are on a cloth that way, so if you're talking about, are they about the same number of samples and the same types of samples, then the proficiency tests seem to be sort of about the same numbers you would receive in an average case, and about the same type. I think they try to make the same types of samples that you would receive in a case, but clearly they're making the samples. They're not like picking them up from an actual crime scene.
Well, for instance, Dr. Cotton, in this case, there are several samples which are purported to be mixed stains, or stains from more than one source. Is that right?
Yes,
And that's something that's not uncommon in casework, right?
that's correct.
And so if you wanted to have a proficiency test where you tried to replicate actual casework conditions, it would be a good thing to have some mixed stains thrown in, wouldn't it?
Sure.
And in this case, for instance, Dr. Cotton, there are samples which are purported to be scraped up off the sidewalk. Are you aware of that?
Scraped up off the sidewalk?
I'm sorry, swatched up off the sidewalk.
Yes, I'm aware of
And that there
that.
are samples that are swatched up off of a driveway.
Yes.
And would you agree, Dr. Codden, that samples that are collected from those types of locations are frequently affected by various environmental insults?
Of course.
So factors such as heat, sunlight, moisture, or the substrate condition itself can affect the quality of the testing. Isn't that right?
Sure.
And so if you wanted to have a proficiency test that replicated casework, you would like to supply the laboratory that's being tested with some samples that also have been subjected to various environmental insults, wouldn't you?
Well, you might like to, but I think for the numbers of samples that the proficiency test folks prepare, that's probably not very practical.
But if you wanted to replicate the kinds of environmental conditions you'd see in actual casework, that is something that would be desirable, would it not?
I don't think it's necessary. I'm not even sure that it's desirable, because it would be, what they would be trying to do then would be make, say, 100 sample sets, all of which were identical, because they want to send every lab an identical sample set, and they would be doing it in a way that would lead to those things not being identical. And part of the goal of the proficiency test is to be able to compare one laboratory to the next. So it's really critical in the design of the test that all labs get equivalent samples.
Well, although it may be difficult, Dr. Codden, would you agree that an outside laboratory, somebody creating a proficiency test, could consistently subject the samples that are going to be submitted to some types of environmental insults? Not necessarily all, but some types.
It may be possible for them to do that, but my understanding of how the proficiency tests are put together is that A, that's not the case, and B, in all the guidelines for proficiency tests to be made, that I don't think that requirement to make them that much like case samples is in the guidelines.
Well, Dr. Cotton, do you believe that it's possible, for instance, that when you're creating a proficiency test that's going to go out to many laboratories, that you could take those blood swatches on cotton, for instance, and put them in a room which has a uniform temperature, so they're all subjected to heat? Could that be done?
Sure.
And I think you said during your direct testimony that heat is one of the environmental insults which can actually cause the DNA to degrade.
Yes, I mean, given you're taking them into a room, you could subject them to however high you can crank the thermostat up, I guess, but you could make them all uniform with a particular temperature in a room.
And you could also make them uniform with respect to a certain humidity in that room as well, if you could control the amount of humidity in the room, couldn't you?
I suppose you could design a room to do that, but I don't know. Our air conditioning doesn't control the humidity too well, so I think you'd have to have a special design. You'd have to have a special piece of equipment to
And
do
Dr.
that.
Cotton, I'm sorry.
Yes, please.
You'd have to have a special piece of equipment that is sort of like a cold room. A cold room is just like a huge refrigerator.
And Dr. Cotton, is there a certain kind of light that can also affect the degradation of DNA?
Yes,
What kind of light is that?
ultraviolet light.
And could you also then subject the various control specimens that you're going to send out for DNA testing to ultraviolet light at the same time? That's something that could be done, couldn't it?
You could, but again, I think you'd have to have you'd have to design a special piece of equipment or a special room in which to do that kind of thing.
And would you agree, Dr. Cotton, that well, I'm sorry. When you receive casework samples, you do not know the answer in advance, do you?
No.
The casework samples that come to Cellmark come from some kind of an external agency, such as the Los Angeles Police Department. Isn't that right?
That's right.
Do you agree that external proficiency tests, where you don't know you're being tested on samples, are the most realistic kind of proficiency test to measure laboratory error rate?
I think both tests serve equally well to do that.
Well, I'm asking you about which is more realistic. You agree a moment ago, Dr. Cotton, that it's certainly more realistic when a laboratory doesn't know it's being tested than when it knows it's being tested. Would you agree with that?
Objection, ask and answer.
Call roll.
It's much more, I mean, on a case, you don't know that you don't know the answer. If you receive a proficiency test that looks like a case, then of course that's a lot more like a case than a proficiency test that you know it's a test.
Okay. And, and similarly, Dr. Cotton, in an actual case, you said a moment ago, the samples don't come from within Cellmark, they come from an external agency. Isn't that correct?
That's right.
So likewise, Dr. Cotton, in a proficiency test where the samples are coming from an external agency, that too would be a more realistic kind of proficiency test to measure laboratory error rate than one in which the samples come from within the laboratory.
It is a more realistic type of test when compared to a regular case, but I don't think that it's any better or any worse for looking at laboratory errors than an open proficiency test.
Dr. Cotton, are you familiar with that portion of the National Academy of Science report, DNA Technology and Forensic Science, entitled Laboratory Error Rates?
I've certainly read it. I haven't read it recently.
Would you please take a look at pages 88 to 89?
Yes.
Objection, hearsay.
Call roll. Take a look at it. And while she's doing that, let me see counsel without the reporter, please. Mr. Neufeld.
Have you finished?
Yeah, I am.
Dr. Cotton, you've given an opinion about the usability of different types of, or the usefulness, excuse me, of different types of proficiency tests. Have you considered, in reaching your own opinions on this subject, the National Academy of Science recommendations with respect to measuring laboratory error rate through proficiency testing?
No, I haven't.
You've never considered that at all?
I don't agree with their recommendations.
Well, I'm not asking you whether you agree with the National Academy of Sciences recommendations, Dr. Cotton. What I'm asking you is whether or not these recommendations have been considered by you seriously before you arrived at your own opinions.
I read them, I thought about them, and I have a different opinion than they do about whether or not what they're asking for is realistic and possible.
In reaching your own opinions on the subject of the utility of external blind proficiency testing, have you thus at least relied in part on what's contained in the NRC report, albeit you have disagreed or rejected, if you will, their recommendations?
Objection, unintelligible.
Call roll.
Well, because I don't agree with it, I would say I haven't relied on it. I haven't used this in directing our laboratory to do the types of proficiency testing that we do.
Let me try and understand what you're saying, Dr. Cotton. Are you saying that it's your position that you only rely on those portions of the NRC report that you agree with?
I don't know how to say it more clearly. There are portions of this report that I agree with. There are a substantial number of portions of the report that I do not agree with, that I think either are not well considered or are simply wrong.
So is it fair for me to say, Dr. Cotton, that you have only relied on those portions of the NAS report in arriving at your own opinions that you personally agree with?
Objection assumes facts, not evidence.
Overruled.
Actually misstates the evidence.
Overruled.
At the point that this report came out, I already had a substantial amount of experience at Cellmark, and I had a much larger amount of experience working with DNA in general. I do not need this report to make my opinions.
I'm sorry, Dr. Cotton, but again, my question is it your position that you have only relied then for your own opinions on those portions of the NRC report that you agree with?
What I'm saying is I haven't relied on the report. If it happens that I agree with some things and disagree with some things, those things did not necessarily or have not necessarily played a role in my opinions about DNA typing and how it should be conducted.
Is it your professional and personal approach to the NRC report that if you don't agree with some of their recommendations, that you will not even take them into consideration in reaching your own conclusions?
Objection argumentative.
Sustained. Let's move on.
Well, do you think, Dr. Cotton, that it is appropriate for scientists to give consideration to the opinions of other scientists with whom you disagree?
Objection irrelevant.
Overruled.
What do you mean you can certainly think about them. I mean, the whole point, if somebody says, I don't agree with you, is to think about it and formulate what your opinion is and see if it's the same or different, and think about what somebody said. But if you have thought about it and you don't agree with it, then that's the situation.
And as to these various portions of the NRC report that you disagree with, have you given serious thought to what the author's recommendations are and why they've articulated them?
Objection asked and answered.
We've asked this question now 3 times.
Dr. Cotton, are you familiar with any of the any scientific literature concerning the use of external blind proficiency tests on laboratories doing PCR testing in clinical medicine?
Objection calls for hearsay.
Overruled.
No, I'm not.
Well, in your opinion as an expert, Dr. Cotton, do you believe it would be important for someone in your laboratory to keep track of the rate of false positives for PCR testing in clinical medicine?
I don't actually have a really good answer for that. I'm not familiar with procedures in clinical medicine. We are familiar with procedures in forensic science. They very well may be different. Whether or not our quality assurance manager is familiar with clinical procedures, I can't tell you. I just don't know.
And some people, Dr. Cotton, say that a DNA test can only give you the right result or no result.
Oh, excuse me, objection hearsay. Assumes facts, not an evidence.
Sustained. Rephrase the question.
Have you ever heard that expression, Dr. Cotton, that a DNA test can only give you the right result or the wrong result? I'm sorry, can either give you the right result or no result. Have you ever heard that expression?
I don't know.
Well,
I mean, I'm hearing it now. I hear you saying it. Whether or not I've ever heard it before, I don't remember.
well, now that you've heard it, Dr. Cotton, would you agree that that's not a correct statement?
Would a DNA test either give you the right result or no result?
Right.
That's much too black and white of a statement.
And one of the reasons that it's much too black and white a statement, Dr. Cotton, is I believe, as you've already testified, a DNA test could give you a false positive.
It's possible that it could. It could also give you an inconclusive, could also give you a false negative. There's a lot of in between there.
And if the DNA test gives you a false positive, it means that you are getting a match between two samples that in fact come from different people. Isn't that right?
Yes.
And would you agree, Dr. Cotton, that if one laboratory made many errors in external blind proficiency testing and another laboratory made few, that the laboratory which made many more is more likely to make a mistake in a given case?
Since that's not an evidence, beyond the scope.
Overruled.
Given the generalization that you just stated, yes, I guess I would agree with that.
And do you agree, Dr. Cotton, that interpretation of DNA typing results depends not only on the frequency of a DNA pattern, but on laboratory error rates as well?
No, I don't.
Well, do you agree, Dr. Cotton, that the strength of a DNA evidence depends not only on the frequency of the pattern, but on laboratory error rates as well?
Objection argumentative.
Overruled.
No, I don't.
Well, Dr. Cotton, did you read that portion of the National Academy of Science report which discusses the role of laboratory error rates in assessing the weight of DNA evidence?
That's part of the couple pages you just pointed out to me, is it not?
Yes.
Yes, I read it.
And have you thought about those couple of pages prior to today as well?
Yes.
And have you considered seriously the points that the authors of the NRC report are making with regard to the importance of assessing a laboratory's error rate?
Objection, Your Honor. This has been asked and answered.
Overruled. It's a different question.
Yes, I thought about it.
But you simply disagree with the National Academy of Science recommendations on this particular point, is that right?
Objection calls for
Sustain.
Your Honor, may the
Dr. Cotton, once again, are you saying that the reason you don't rely on this portion of the report is simply because you disagree with it?
No, I'm not.
asked and answer are also irrelevant.
Sustain.
Well, would you agree, Dr. Cotton, that the measure of a laboratory's error rate is a separate and independent issue from the measurement of the frequency of a DNA profile?
Of course.
I'm solid drug.
So I couldn't get your answer. Could you
She said,
repeat?
of course.
Of course it is.
Well, do you agree with that portion of the NRC report which explicitly states that,
Excuse me, Your Honor, objection. Hearsay.
Sustain.
I'm not going to quote the portion.
Still hearsay, Counselor. I think,
Do,
let's move on.
Dr. Cotton, do you agree with the sentiments of the NRC report
Sustain.
on that issue?
Wait, wait. Sustain. Move on.
Well, would you agree, Dr. Cotton, that if someone was falsely implicated by an RFLP DNA test, it would much more likely be due to sample handling error or cross-contamination rather than due to a coincidental match between people with the same RFLP profile?
Yes, sure.
Now, your laboratory has had at least a couple of instances where you had false matches due to sample handling error and cross-contamination. Isn't that correct?
Yes, two.
The objection compound.
Overruled.
Two.
And using the definition of the 4 types of proficiency tests that I've given you in that diagram, whose number escapes me.
1153.
Thank you. On 1153, in 1993, how many of your proficiency tests fall into the category of external blind proficiency tests?
In 1993, we have very few in external because it's a complicated answer.
Well, do you prepare a chart where you list the proficiency tests that you run in a given year? Do you have a chart like that?
Yes, we do.
And on that chart, do you actually identify which of the proficiency tests are internal versus which ones are external?
Yes, we do.
And on that chart, do you also differentiate between those that are blind and those that are open?
Yes.
And would you agree, by the way, Dr. Cotton, that at least for forensic cases, there's a difference between doing a proficiency test on a paternity sample with a mother and a child and a purported father than there is in forensic casework proficiency testing?
Oh, sure, but we have to do paternity proficiency tests also.
Okay. So my question is, Dr. Cotton, if you look at your memo, will you be able to tell us in 1993 how many blind external proficiency tests you did of a forensic nature?
Sure.
Okay?
There aren't any.
I'm sorry, what?
I can tell you right now, blind external, there aren't any.
Okay. And in 1992, Dr. Cotton, how many blind external proficiency tests utilizing forensic type samples did Cellmark participate in?
None. We have never done a blind external, received from an external agency, proficiency test because there is no external agency which provides those kinds of tests, so there is no way to get one.
So, Dr. Cotton, is it fair to say then in the entire 6 years that your laboratory has been doing proficiency testing, there is not a single instance when you have ever been subjected to a blind external proficiency test?
That's exactly right.
Would you agree then, Dr. Cotton, that in the absence of being submitted to any blind external proficiency tests, that you really have no scientific basis for estimating your laboratory's error rate?
No, I don't agree with that.
Are you aware, Dr. Cotton, that the DNA laboratories that type bloods for bone marrow transplant registry routinely are subjected to blind external proficiency tests,
Objection assumes facts not in evidence.
subject to connection?
Overruled. You aware of that practice, Doctor?
No, I'm not.
So would it be fair to say, Dr. Cotton, that the only types of tests that you have available for estimating your error rate, as far as proficiency tests goes, are either those tests where you were testing yourself or those tests where you knew you were being tested? Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Dr. Cotton, can you cite a single article in the field of laboratory quality assurance which permits a laboratory to assess its own error rate based on open and internal tests?
No, I can't.
Now, Dr. Cotton, I'm about to move on to something new, Your Honor. I don't know if you want to break now.
All right. Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to take our recess for the morning session. Please remember all of my admonitions to you. Do not discuss this case amongst yourselves. Don't form any opinions about the case. Don't allow anybody to communicate with you. Do not conduct any deliberations till the matter has been submitted to you. We'll stand in recess until 1 o'clock. All right, Dr. Cotton, you can step down. Let the record reflect we've been rejoined by all the members of our jury panel. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. And Mr. Neufeld, you may continue.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Good afternoon, Dr. Cotton.
Good afternoon, Mr. Neufeld.
Now, Dr. Cotton, putting aside the absence of external blind proficiency tests at Cellmark, would it be fair to say that you have participated in a number of open proficiency tests since 1988?
Yes, we have.
And would it be fair to say that in these open proficiency tests that you've participated in, you routinely would receive a few samples to examine, or certainly no more than a handful of samples.
It's vague.
Yes,
Handful of samples.
That you would receive no more than, let's say, 5 samples in any proficiency test.
yeah, I would say usually it's 3 or 4 per test.
Now, in this case, however, this case meaning People versus Mr. Simpson, you have received how many different samples from the Los Angeles Police Department to do DNA typing on? If you need to look at your records to calculate that number, please do.
Twenty-three.
Excuse me?
23?
Okay.
Well, that's how far, starting at 01, for our sample numbers, we went up to 23.
Fine. Now, unlike those various open tests that you just referred to a moment ago, where ordinarily you would have 3 or 4 samples given to you to examine, were there 2 proficiency tests that you were participating in 1988 and 1989 where you received 50 samples in each?
One was 49 and the other was 50.
Okay? And those tests in 1988 and 1999 were sponsored by the California Association of Crime Laboratory Directors?
Yes, they were.
The objection, I think. Question misstates the evidence.
Overruled.
If I said 99 when I meant 1989, I apologize.
I understood what you meant.
Okay. Now, let's take a look first at the proficiency tests run by the California Association of Crime Laboratory Directors that you participated in the year 1988. First of all, in that proficiency test, did you have any incorrect exclusions?
No, we didn't.
Now, in that particular test, Dr. Cotton, you were given these different samples, and you were asked to type them and determine which, if any, matched any of the other samples. Is that correct, in the same batch?
That's right.
And at a subsequent point in time, were you provided with a legend produced by the California Association of Crime Lab Directors telling you which samples, in fact, matched which other samples?
Yes.
And when you were provided with that legend, Dr. Cotton, didn't they tell you that items 70, 72, and 76 should all match one another?
That may be right. I don't have my copies with me. I do actually have them in the building, but I don't have them down here with me, so I might need to look at yours.
Fine. Next in order,
1154.
which is a
1154.
6-page report from the California Association of Crime Laboratory Directors. I show you this exhibit, this six-page document from the California Association of Crime Lab Directors, and ask you if it refreshes your recollection as to whether or not items 70, 72, and 76 all come from the same source.
Yes, it does.
Okay? And now that it refreshes your recollection, is it in fact true that the way this test was set up, that samples 70, 72, and 76 all originated from the same person?
Yes.
And when you did the DNA typing, you meaning Selmark, not you personally necessarily, did the DNA typing on those three samples, didn't you conclude that although samples 70 and 72 matched one another, that sample 76 had a distinct pattern and did not match either 70 or 72?
That pretty much fits with my recollection, but if I'm remembering this group of three correctly, one of them is a mixture. You know, I don't have all my documentation of what we reported with me, so...
Well, Dr. Codden, isn't it a fact, and by the way here, if you'd like to refresh your recollection, here is Selmark's report to the California Association. I would ask this be marked next in line, next in order,
1155.
which is a three-page document.
Okay, you want to ask me your question again now?
Certainly. But you need to look at it when we answer
It-
it. I'll give it right back to you.
For a series of these questions regarding this test, if I
Sure.
could have a copy of both the CACLD table and my report, it would make it a lot easier for me to answer the questions more easily.
Let me just ask you this question. I'll give you the report before you answer the question if you need it, all right?
Okay.
First of all, didn't you say in your report on this particular test,
Mr. Neufeld, don't you think you need a foundational question? What is, does she
Oh.
recognize what it is?
do you recognize this three-page document that I just showed you?
Yes, I do.
And is it your final report to the California Association of Crime Laboratory Directors with respect to your results on the 1988 proficiency test that they gave you?
Yes, it is.
And in that report, Dr. Cotton, didn't you state that the patterns obtained from stains numbered 70 and 72 were the same?
Yes.
And didn't you state in that same report that you did obtain a pattern for sample 76 that was suitable for comparison purposes, but was not found to match the other samples tested?
Yes, we did say that.
And would you agree, Dr. Cotton, that since 76 is supposed to come from the same person as 70 and 72, the fact that you got a pattern but you failed to match it with 70 and 72 would be a would be a false exclusion?
I wouldn't phrase it that way, first of all, because I would need to determine whether that was this mixture that I was remembering. And secondly, you have to go back to the films to look at the two patterns that you're talking about and see if there's enough data in each of those. That is, if you can't, not making a match is sort of like saying it's inconclusive. We didn't actually even make a list in this report of things which were specifically excluded. So It may mean, based on the data, that we were unable to come to a conclusion, not that we literally said something was excluded and then it was not.
Well, Dr. Codden, isn't it a fact that item 76 was not a mixture?
Yeah, let me come back to this. No, item 76 was not a mixture, but item 72 was a mixture.
And what about item 70?
And item 70 was not a mixture.
Right. So item 76, according to the way this test was set up, should have matched item 70. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. And even though you got a pattern for item 76, which was not a mixture, you did not state that it matched item 70. Isn't that correct?
That's right.
And so the failure to declare that match would be a mistake, wouldn't it? By the definition of the test.
It would if the two patterns were both of equal quality and we just missed it. Remember that remember, you don't, I guess you don't really know this, but each of these samples, these 49 samples, was extracted as if it were a sexual assault sample because we had no information. And in that type of extraction, which is not something that was done in this particular case, you try to separate DNA from a sperm fraction from any DNA that's in something else. So of the 49 samples, you end up with really 2 samples from each of the 49, giving you a total of 98. And so you have 98 patterns which were manually, visibly compared to one another. And if the patterns are both good, and I can't recall if they are, the fact that we missed seeing it in all this comparison of 98 patterns with, every other pattern of the 98 is an error in finding that match, but in my mind I do not think of it as a false exclusion,
Well,
a wrongful exclusion.
I appreciate that you don't consider it a wrongful exclusion, but, and you said that one of your concerns was that you don't know how clear the pattern was. Is that correct?
That's right.
Well, the fact that your report states that the pattern for 76 was suitable for comparison purposes, would that refresh your recollection as to whether the pattern for 76 was in fact suitable
Right.
for comparison purposes? Would it?
I understand that it says that, but that doesn't give me any information. The mixture pattern was a problem, and it doesn't provide any information about the pattern for 70. So,
Excuse me, Dr.
I'm
Cott?
sorry, could the witness finish
I
her
thought
answer,
she was
please?
finished.
Well, so is a pause, clearly. Proceed.
well, what I'm saying is that I don't have enough information in front of me to give you a clear answer as to whether or not that was not mentioned because it was basically an inconclusive, or whether or not we simply missed seeing the match and we could have made a match and did not.
Dr. Cotton, is there any qualification in this report when you're describing the pattern comparisons of sample 70, which is not a mixture, with sample 72?
No, there isn't.
And of course, in your laboratory, you wouldn't have called a match if that pattern on item number 70 wasn't sufficiently clear and robust to compare with 72. Isn't that right?
That would be correct in general, but I remember that, I've looked at these films on several different occasions. They are not as good as the films that we produce now, and so there are things about those films that might lead to problems in interpretation.
And Dr. Cotton, you wouldn't have said in your report, quote, referring to item number 76, these patterns were suitable for comparison purposes, but were not found in the other samples tested, unquote, unless that was true, would you?
No.
Okay. One moment. Next in order.
1156.
This is the order rad for this particular. One moment. Todd, and I show you this photograph and ask you, is that photograph reflecting a comparison of samples 70, 72, and 76 that we were just discussing?
Yes, it seems to be, except these weren't all on the same film, so this appears to be various, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 patterns from different films lined up to be able to photograph them.
But the actual lanes themselves represent the samples that were tested by your laboratory in this proficiency test, correct?
Yes, can I ask a question about the picture? Do you know whether or not the labeling across, the labeling across the top must have been put on in order to make the picture. So
The labeling across the top, very much the same way the labeling was put on the order rads in this particular
Okay.
case, so you could identify which lanes are attributable to which samples. Same thing was done in this photograph. Does that help?
Okay. Yes, it does.
Okay. Of course, Commissioner, I'd like to put it up on the envelope. Ronna, what is the easiest way for me to point to different lanes for the witness?
Probably the PowerPoint.
Use this? Dr. Kai, would you like to step down? I think it would be
I
easier for you
would.
to see this. Now, in this particular proficiency test, series of order rads, it's basically divided up into 3 different samples. As you can see at the top of the photograph there, there's sample 70, sample 72, and finally sample 76. Do you see that?
I do.
Okay. And the lane that represents the non-Seaman fraction of sample 76 is the second lane from the right, where the pink arrow is pointing at. Do you see that?
Yes, I do.
Okay. And now what I'd like you to do is not look at the mixture, but I'd like you to compare. Can we put a pink dot just so we'll have a permanent point of reference there, so the witness can go back and forth? Right. Now, what I'd like you to do is compare the pattern that you see in that lane, the second lane from the right, to go all the way across to sample 70, to the third lane, which is also the non-Seaman fraction of sample 70. You see that?
Yes, I see it.
Okay, can you put a mark there as well, please? Was it permanent mark there? Okay. Now, Dr. Cotton, according to the providers of this test, the profile in item 70 that the pink arrow is looking at on the left should match the pattern in sample 76, where there's an arrow there on the far right. Isn't that correct?
No, I don't think so.
Well, both sample 70 and sample 76 are not mixtures. Isn't that correct?
That's right. I think you are misreading their key, because it is sample 72 that is a mixture of 70 and 76, and 76 clearly does not match 70. But 70 should match one pattern in 72, and 76 should match the other pattern in 72.
One moment. Again, referring you to the code that was given to you by the California Association of Crime Laboratory Directors after you did these tests, wouldn't you agree that sample 70 is simply semen, not a mixture that was collected on 7/85? Would you agree with that?
Yes.
And would you agree, Dr. Cotton, that for item number 76, it is also the same semen that was drawn on July of 1985, according to this log?
That's not, yes, it's semen, but it's not the same as 70. I don't think that's the intention of that sample description.
On the face of this sample description, Dr. Cotton, would you agree that it says that item 70 and item 76 come from the same person?
I don't think that's what that means.
From looking at this report, is it your understanding that the California Association of Crime Laboratories grouped all samples that came from the same person in the same box?
What they've done is grouped all samples that could be related in the same box, and these are grouped together because both 70 and 76 should match 72, because 72 is a mixture. So that's why they're in the same box, but it doesn't mean, and I'm sure that they could confirm this, that 70 and 76 were the same. I mean, there wouldn't be any point of making a mixture of 70 and 76 if they were from the same person. And so I feel confident that that's what that means.
Okay, one moment. We work off of your premise, Dr. Cotton, that nonetheless, according to this log, sample 76 should be consistent with the mixed stain in sample 72. Isn't that correct?
Yes, you're absolutely right.
And would you agree, Dr. Cotton, that in your report, you failed to state or include 76 as being consistent with the profile in 72?
Yes, that's right, we did.
Okay, you can have a seat again, please. With the court's permission, I'd like to put up next in order, which would be,
1157.
well, it's not actually, it's going to be one page of the 6-page report of the CACLD.
All right. Which page?
It's going to be page 5.
All right, page 5 of 1154.
Okay.
Need to clear the PowerPoint there, Mr. Harris. Thank you. Sustain.
Dr. Cotton, did you say you recognize this 6-page report as the report that you received from the California Association of Crime Laboratory Directors assessing your results in this proficiency test?
What I did was look at the 2 keys, and I recognize them. If you'd like me to look at the 6 pages, then I can.
Oh, please do. I'm sorry. I thought you had.
Yes, the report was, I believe, not just to us, the other two labs that participated and other people within the CACLD.
But is this an accurate copy of the report that you received from the California Association of Crime Laboratory Directors regarding the results of the 1988 proficiency tests?
Yes, it is.
And by the way, when you ordinarily participate in proficiency tests, is it the ordinary course of business that the provider of the proficiency test furnishes the participant with a report evaluating your performance?
Yes, it is.
And is this report that type of report?
Yes.
Your Honor, with the court's permission, I'd now like to put up page 5.
Sustain. Do you have an exception?
And when these proficiency tests are given to laboratories such as your own, is the provider of the proficiency test under an obligation to report the results accurately?
Yeah, I think they certainly would try to do that. I've seen mistakes in reports, but, you know, everybody, when they do this, is trying to report the results accurately.
And that would be the general obligation of any provider of this type of report.
Yes.
I would offer the page again, Your Honor. I think it's a business record exception, Your Honor.
Not with this foundation. You're missing 3 points at this point.
And Dr. Cotton, was this report sent to you in the ordinary course of business?
Yes, it was.
And is a copy of this report actually retained by you in your records as part of the ordinary course of Cellmark's business?
Yes, it is.
Again, Your Honor, I believe that...
Counsel, why don't you take a look at the evidence code? You're still missing a few items.
One moment, Your Honor.
Doctor, are the results that are contained in this report recorded at or near the time of the events that it reflects?
Since I didn't participate in writing the report, I wouldn't know. I mean, I know that it was done after the proficiency tests were completed, but that's all I know in terms of its timing.
And who maintains these records?
They would be maintained by the CACLD.
And are they relied upon as being accurate by those persons, members of that organization?
I assume so.
Court's help may now publish page 5.
Please.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Your Honor.
I'm just trying to save some time here.
I appreciate it.
Sorry, I still have an objection as to at least one of the elements, Your Honor.
Overruled.
Now, Dr. Cotton, in this particular test, you received 49 samples from the California Association of Crime Laboratory Directors. Is that correct?
That's right.
In fact, the data that applies to Cellmark would be in the column on the far right of that particular exhibit.
That's right.
And of the 49 samples that you received, you were able to generate results on 44 of those 49. Is that correct?
Yes, yes, that we have some kind of DNA results from 44.
And so as to the remaining 5 samples, that would be the third number in that column, you were unable to generate DNA results.
Yes, that's what the report says.
And now the 4th item on that list is a number 1. Is that correct? With a series of little asterisks next to it?
That's right.
And that number 1 indicates that out of the 44 samples that you were able to type, that you made 1 incorrect match. Isn't that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
And when we say 1 incorrect match, that would be the equivalent of 1 false positive. Isn't that correct?
That's correct.
Now, the way you got this false positive, Dr. Codd, in this particular proficiency test is that there were 2 samples, namely 57 and 58, that came from the same person. Isn't that right?
Well, again, I don't remember the sample numbers, but there were 2 samples that you can go on, and I'm pretty sure I can follow you without the specific sample numbers.
Let me show you a photograph. Next to the one. Let me show you, Dr. Cotton, what is